Hello everyone who's joining us from the front page. What's up? My name is Opes. I love to play Animal Crossing and
Hey everybody, what's up ZBrush friends? Just giving everybody a second to jump in here. Any of you guys just jumping in, give me a shout. Let me know you just want to do a quick audio check, make sure everybody can hear me. Looks like everybody can see me. I'm also going to give you guys a shout. Mode Caleb, how's it going? Thanks for the check-in. Perfect. Gonna get my early sips in before I get started. What's up, Pro 4210? Thanks for tuning in, man. What is the 4210? Now I have to know. All right, so for anybody who, I'll get started here for all you guys who are just jumping in. Pro, I know you've been in a couple of my other streams before. Thanks for coming back to this one. And any newcomers that haven't watched me stream before, I'm a developer at Pixologic. Normally I do streams in full ZBrush, jumping on board with the rest of the crew here. You said you just rolled off the tongue, 42-1. Oh, I got it. Yeah, I shorten numbers. Once I go past two numbers, I automatically shorten it. I'm from Michigan originally. I don't know if that's a Midwest thing, but I don't know. The way you say it is better. Stefano, how you doing? So yeah, so I'm picking up the reins, trying to help out the rest of the development team and do some streaming in ZBrushCore. Those of you guys who have ZBrushCore, maybe you guys check out some of the full versions of ZBrush streams. This one's going to be a little different from mine because normally a lot of time I'm spending more time just building stuff. If you go to, let me go pull up my ZBC page. Check me out on ZBrushCentral.com, Solomon_Blair. You can see just one of my more recent projects I did a live stream on. I say this every time, but I haven't updated a lot of my ZBC content yet. I need to get actually some more imagery here, but you can find me there. You can communicate. Also up here in the top left, you guys can follow me on Instagram, hit me up there. I would love to follow you guys and build a network of artists and all that. So if you guys ever need anything, you can always reach me there. I'm there all the time. So yeah, this stream I'm going to go through, this is going to be another project-based stream for those that have followed my other ones where I want to go through and maybe do 2 or 3 streams of completing a character or completing a project. And in this case, this is just a stylized character I wanted to put together and kind of breeze through some of the ZBrushCore features and really just go through and see what we can get done. So it's going to be, focused from start to finish. I'm going to go through and do the sort of block out phase, get the character in pose, building the accessories, all that good stuff. So I guess at this point, the only thing I want to reference here is that I am kind of looking at a lot of my reference. I'm kind of looking at, I like the style of like Fortnite characters, even though it's there's so many characters in that universe. There's a lot of great stuff to pull from, but I like the style. I want to go with something just in terms of like the kinds of detail for a stylized character. I like the amount of detail they have. It's not too simplified, but it's got enough stuff to play around with, building inside of ZBrush and being able to make some good surfaces. So if you guys have questions, feel free to throw them out there. I'm happy to roll through it. So for me, I spend so much time in full ZBrush in ZBrushCore. There are the core foundations of the sculpting tools, a lot of the basic brushes. Most of the brushes that I use in ZBrush are here in ZBrushCore as well in terms of sculpting. So we're going to be able to get a lot of this done. Now, to get started, though, for this particular figure, what I like to do, there's a couple ways that you can start in ZBrushCore, and a lot of people, depending on the way that you want to work, this character is going to be in post, the final sort of output. So for me, you could, of course, if you're familiar with ZBrushCore features, starting with the Z-Sphere is a pretty great place to go. You could start with the Z-Sphere, you know, throw on your Symmetry. We could start by just like blocking out. Just go ahead and, you know, or actually, let's take a look inside of the projects tab. Like you can go in here, grab a, go to the projects. I'll just grab the cave troll. This is one I made quite a while ago, actually. I forget which version, but just something in post, right? This is something that we wouldn't necessarily be able to sculpt symmetrically. So if we want to start getting in the form and shape, like doing anatomy on one side of the body and having it match on the other is not really going to work for us once you go through. So using Z-spheres is a great way to get a character into pose, but basically that means that you're going to be spending all your sculpting time sort of working on the whole figure without symmetry. And for some people, that's perfectly fine. For me, I don't want to spend too much time sculpting with you guys. Just because it can get kind of boring. I want to go through all the process and the entirety of it, and just so you know that this project here, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a tutorial as well. So completing a full tutorial that shows all the sculpting and all that stuff if anybody's ever interested in that from here on out. So we could start, this is something I would consider is like, I thought about this when I started, is maybe starting with the Z-sphere and blocking it out. In my case, I want to take advantage of symmetry, so I'm going to try and use some tricks here to make this work without doing an asymmetrical Z-sphere character and putting it into this sort of pose before I go sculpt it. So just get back to loading that project there. First thing I want to do is figure out proportions. I think proportions and getting just the full sort of fleshed out portion of the character in view is the best place to start, just to get that there into place. And I thought about a couple ways that we could do this. There's not, in terms of, we can, you know, use image reference on the side, but here I'm just going to pull up a little picture here. So you'll see here, this is something that I considered to kind of go through and figuring out how to get just the muscle and form with symmetry in place, as well as figuring out the height and the proportions on all this. If you go the Marvel sort of Jack Kirby sort of road, you'll see in the middle, the image that you see, we've got their figures, which should be 8 heads tall. So the superhero sort of body proportions are roughly 7 to 8 heads tall, depending on the type of character it is. So following that sort of mold, basically what we can do is create a head, and we can use that head in duplicate form to go through. You'll see on the right side, the image here. That's just me sort of going through, and so starting with the head, getting the height range of the character, and then I can use that to sort of correlate different sort of parts of the body and get that stuff fleshed out. Dougie, what's going on, man? Welcome back. So yeah, so what I want to do is I just want to get going, and I want to get this the head sort of figured out. So, you know, this is the character that I kind of whipped up in a couple days, just trying to concept out what I wanted to do for the stream. So I might not do exactly the same thing. The figure, the face, and all that might sort of be a little bit different, but I want to get this, you know, sort of like, I'll stick to the same, probably same pose. Maybe mess around with some other sort of styles for the face and accessories and things. So yeah, to get started, we want to do just a skull or the face. Now, I'll leave this character, I'm going to leave this project open that's got some of my other stuff. So I want to get to, like, you know, even just in core, we can get some pretty cool, like, extra little details, like starting to get most of the accessories fleshed out. So I want to focus on just keeping this project here, but I'm going to go in and let's just grab a sphere. So how I would start this entire process here is I'd probably go into Dynamesh. I would absolutely go to Dynamesh, and I'd start with Dynamesh Sphere 32. So I'm going to actually, instead of double clicking to load that, that'll get rid of all my stuff here. I'm actually just going to set this up on my own. So I'm going to go grab a Sphere 3D, click Make Polymesh, and I'm going to go Dynamesh, set this to 32, and then let's just turn that on. So we get Dynasphere 32. And then go into the floor grid. I always keep my stuff assigned, so X symmetry is the way I go. Oh, sorry guys. Thanks for that call out. The reference is over the model. You are right. Boom. Yeah, so I'm using OBS to play my graphics here. In the full version of ZBrush, if you guys watch my other streams, I bring images into Spotlight and arrange them on the canvas. In Core, we can't do that. We don't have that functionality. So, yeah, so I'll pop that thing on and off at times. Yeah, you guys got to keep me up on that because I might forget. Can you guys see it now? Digital Plankton, Dafu, Bode. Okay, great. Yeah, I turned it off. There might be a little bit of a delay. Okay, great. Let me just get situated here. So a skull. If you haven't done this before, I always like to start with a, if you're doing a face, the skull is the foundation of the object. If you're into ZBrush, most likely you've all gone to school for this, or you've learned from some of the pros. And getting a good planar skull is a good place to start, or at least the planars sort of angles of the face. So what I'm going to do is I have some reference that I'm looking at on the side that I'll kind of be going back and forth to. But if you want to, just Google, sculpture, human face planar, something along those lines, the planes of the human face, and you'll find tons of great reference. So I want to stick to that just to kind of get a quick foundation. An easy way that I just start with this is move brush to me is king. Kind of just going in with move brush, and let's just start hitting the major shape of that skull. You guys, I'm curious, how many of you have sculpted a human skull? Because this is, for me, it was like one of the first things I ever did in ZBrush, and I always end up sculpting these things. I probably sculpted hundreds of skulls at this point. Not all of them great, of course. It's a tough thing to do. Just curious how many of you guys have actually done the same. Zofo, definitely. How did it go? Was it rough? The shapes that I always end up pulling reference for this, but you get that back sort of cranium space that sort of tapers in. So it's a little bit bigger on the back side. It is very hard, isn't it? It's so hard to capture all those planes. So like as I move around just re-dynameshing, I like to use Dynamesh for this because you could use Sculptors Pro, definitely. But what I'm going to get into using is the polish feature to start hitting these planes and really start to like form and shape all this stuff as we go. So once I get like enough of the shape here, I might bring this up. Like I like to use a big move brush for this stuff. A little bit wider in the back, tapers in. Yeah, studying pencil, that's good. Drawing it is a whole nother thing too. I haven't drawn anatomy in such a long time. I've been spending so much time sculpting over the years now. Once I got introduced to sculpture, especially digital sculpture, honestly, I didn't go back to 2D. That's where I started, but I know it's a shame, but I have so much respect for people that are able to do, high quality 2D artwork. For me, I like the functionality and the logic behind sculpting something. For some reason, to me, my brain clicks a little bit better. Stefan, you've done tons of real clay, tons of ZBrush. Yeah, I bet your stuff is super pro then. Doing it in clay and then digital is like, that's really the highest form, I think, is doing both of those is really important to become a good sculptor. Brody Perkins, what's up, man? All right. So I got this crappy little shape. Now I want to start just hitting those planes. But before I do, I always like to go... Actually, let's start by just... I'm going to punch in the front space here. So I'm using H polish with a pretty big draw stroke here. I always like to go in and just kind of, especially when you're doing a sphere, you get a lot of curvature happening there. And I always want to get in just the shape of the eye sockets. And if that thing's curved a little bit, I mean, you want it to have curvature, of course, but I'm going to go through and bump that out later. I just like to go through and just kind of flush this in. So I'll Dynamesh this. I know the bridge of the nose is going to be kicked in a little bit more. Sajid, welcome. Thank you. Hopefully I can actually show you some good stuff today. All right, so I'm kind of going with just a clay brush here. I like to use the clay. This is a little inside with ZBrush, but if you got a heavy hand, which I know I do, I always reduce the intensities. Like clay buildup, if you keep going, it keeps building up, which is a great way to get form in its natural state. You can kind of keep going across and build and build and build. But when I'm doing stuff like this, I like to use the clay brush. This one, if you keep going over where your stroke is already touched, it doesn't build. So it only builds in new spaces. So if you keep going across, you see it won't build any higher. It just goes around. So I like to do this so I just click and let go of my cursor. I just keep adding slightly. I kind of get more control out of that. And I'm sure that this forehead. So something I like to do is I press the V key sometimes to switch colors. I set both of these to white. So that way, if I accidentally press V, it doesn't. The V is the alternate button, or swaps between those colors. So in the full version of ZBrush, you'll see that there. Is clay polish good for stylized characters? I think so. Especially, there's one thing you'll notice that I'm doing right now is I like to stay, especially when you're sculpting this kind of stuff, you don't want the details to start showing out, especially with stylized. Like even doing the planar portion is going to make this a little bit more, in terms of like realism. You're going to start hitting more of those realistic sort of angles, but the planes don't really change whether it's stylized or realistic. So you want those to show through. Clay to me has a nice soft sort of effect. So it's a soft brush stroke that doesn't, you're really just trying to capture form, not actual, intense brush details. So in my opinion, it's a very good one. All right, so let's see here. Let's start. I'm going to take this. Once I get this in place, I won't really be able to. One thing that I've learned is as soon as you start to noodle with one particular area and you don't kind of get the large strokes, the big breadth of the entire thing going, you start to waste time. So I'm going to go up a little bit higher, go up to about 80. I'm going to re-Dynamesh this. And I'm just going to go in with H polish now. And I'm just looking at some reference over here. Like you'll have essentially, let's see if we can sketch these out. You got a nice sort of arc happening here. You got some arcs happening here. You got some arcs going about. So I'm using Damien Standard with the Alt key to kind of go in and just sketch this out. There, then we get some arcs going up here. This is basically going to keep traveling back. All right, so this whole one right here, this is one giant sort of plane. So we can go in with H polish and we can start to punch this in. So this is where you get that like zygomatic arch, if you're familiar with the bone structure, that cheekbone area. It's one thing I've tried to do this stuff without planes before, and I find that it's harder to get those shapes. I mean, eventually you kind of learn how the stuff works, of course, but when you're just learning anatomy too, it's really kind of important to understand these kinds of underlying structures. Otherwise, things just don't line up. So if you stay low, pretty low res in this state, the mesh is more malleable. It's easier to work with. I love that. If you go too high in resolution, this stuff starts to get harder to work. You know, the brushes will be harder. This brush strokes will be harder to smooth out. Bode saying, you're asking what's the biggest difference between the pinch and the dam standard tool? That's a good question. Dam standard, okay, so pinch, really the big difference is when you look at that poly frame, the pinch, the brush is number one, the focal shift and draw size are different. So the pinch brush has focal shift at 0. So when I go across this surface, it's basically grabbing everything within that draw stroke radius, and it's just pulling that into a zone. So you see like the points that are closer together along the brush path, those tighten up, but it does slide away some of the ones sort of outside of it. So you see this stuff here and this stuff here starts to sort of slide through with it. So it's just kind of pulling everything in. It's averaging it out. So the closer you are to the center, the stronger it is. And then as it gets further away outside of the brush, you pull more of those vertex points. So this can be really nice if you do like a big draw stroke. You can pull in a lot of vertex points to kind of tighten that stuff up. Damien Standard, what that's doing is, number one, that has a focal shift setting. And basically, if you go and you hold Alt, it's essentially just like if you hold the Alt key, it's doing an add. You'll see the brush defaults Z sub. So Z sub, when you just draw it by default, it carves in. So this one affects less of the vertex points around it, depending on that draw size. And that's really, in terms of how the thing looks at the end, like pinch, if you go really big and you go through and you pinch all this, you could pull a lot of those verts and really pinch all that stuff together. So if I go like mid-range, I could start pinching all that stuff. I wouldn't be able to do that with Damien Standard. If I go Damien Standard, sometimes I'll go big draw size and I'll hold Alt key. That's really only going to draw a very tightly focused stroke, mainly not just because of the focal shift, but this alpha. This alpha here is really what drives this brush. So that's what I would say the difference is. Like, depending on, you can, when you use them in certain ways, they're kind of the same. If you keep the draw size pretty small, they'll be about the same. But I'd say the pinch has a lot more ability if you change that draw size and really increase how much you're grabbing in that thing. So hopefully that answers your question. I like to experiment with brushes like that all the time, just to get like little different techniques, like that specific thing, like using pinch versus Damien Standard with Alt key to get a little sort of like hard line, is two ways that you could do it. You know, pinch sometimes I think destroys too much of the surface, whereas Damien Standard, I think I can get a more focused line. And if I want to grab a lot of these verts, I might just use pinch, right? And then one thing you'll notice too is, like, I like to use brush hotkeys. In ZBrushCore, we got all the core brushes down here. We have H polish, we have move sitting here at the bottom. I do the hotkeys, so H polish and core is BH, Claybuildup, BCB, move is BMV. I kind of have those keys mapped in my brain to isolate out those hotkeys, which are in the palette. If you guys don't ever use those, you can find those there. You just click open the brush palette, click the first letter of the brush that you want. So if I want clay, I press C. That gives me all the C brushes. And then once you filter down to this level, here you'll see you get numbers or letters. So if I want clay, I press L. Oh, nice. Bode, you're saying that was helpful. Okay, good. If you didn't know much about, yeah, that's basically what happens when it alters that sort of surface. All right. So try not to fiddle too much here. So I'm actually going to go in and just hollow out this space a little bit more. I'm going to dump in some eyes here pretty soon. I want to show you guys a little technique to get eyes in, because sculpting eyelids is going to be tough. Sculpting lips even tougher. I might sculpt the lips though, just because I think that I have a fairly decent approach that I could share with you guys. So here I'm just trying to get the sort of eyelid sort of droop happening right here. Now with Dynamesh, once I start hitting all these planes, as I've sort of laid in some foundations here, I've got some hard lines happening. If I go into Dynamesh, turn on polish, and then control drag to re-Dynamesh, it's going to keep a lot of those sharp edges. So it just focuses in on, essentially what this does is when you turn on polish, polish is really actually using a mode called clay polish, which is, if you click clay polish, all it does is it looks at verts that are close together as you've drawn a stroke. And what happens when you click clay polish is that, depending on the level of sharpness, if those verts are closer together, when you click it, it brings them closer and it brings them tighter. And if you keep clicking it, it'll keep going. Now, clay polish eventually, though, what it does, if you keep running it, is it starts to kind of muck up the surface. Like, it brings those verts really close together, almost in an uneven way. So when you go in with a brush stroke, sometimes the stroke or the surface underneath can't quite capture it. So the benefit here is, what we're doing is we're doing clay polish each time we Dynamesh. So when you turn that on, it's running that setting. So if you want those lines to be sharper, you see right now, if I control drag and you get a little sharpness. If I want those to be even sharper, if I go undo, go back to clay polish, set this sharpness to say 10, and then go back to Dynamesh and re-Dynamesh it, you'll see that those edges are going to get even sharper. So Pros and cons. Like I don't prefer to use too much sharpness because then you start to get more angles here that I don't want. So less sharpness, it doesn't capture as much of those details, and you get a pretty good result. That way it captures those facets that I've been sort of putting in by hand. All right, so now I'm just trying to figure out where the chin is. I'm going to go ahead and just start moving this out. So the lips, you know, you're going to get, if you think about the angle, checking your profiles is really important too. So one thing that I haven't been doing a very good job of is rotating. So rotating to that side view, you want to have a nice clean sort of arc happening. So what I really need to do is take that sort of shape here. And this is one of those reasons I just saw Dafu. I'm not referencing the skull right now. All I'm referencing is I have a planar sculpt sort of over here on my side screen, just ortho views. Yeah, Zofo, at this point, you were saying you tend to go too high with Dynamesh. That's something that a lot of people do, myself included. I've done it so much in the past, and I've learned, like, I sort of started pretty, you know, back before we even had Dynamesh. I was getting into this industry before I was even working for Pixologic. And back then, all the modeling that you did was based on low topology surfaces. You didn't have organic shapes like this. You didn't have Dynamesh to dynamically resurface. You basically just had to build a really low poly base mesh in Maya, and you bring that thing into ZBrush, and you click subdivide, and that's your sculpting. That's what you would do. So I learned how to sculpt at low resolutions. That's kind of how I got started with digital sculpting. But then when I got Dynamesh, it was like, oh, now I have all these high resolution surfaces to work with. But I've sort of gone back to, I like the low surface to start with at the very least, because it honestly, it makes a difference in, it just makes a difference in how the surface is easy to work with. And I find that to be a little bit more manageable and forgiving with the way that I sculpt. Some people, though, I've seen like really great sculptors that can just do amazing work at high resolutions and they don't have issues. It's actually very remarkable. And I respect those people so much that are able to do that. I think to me that's a pretty high level ability of sculpture for sure. So I'm just trying to like define out where the space between the mouth and the bottom of this jawline is. I'm just kind of drawing a mask, trying to create a little bit more space in there. Omega, you're saying that's useful stuff for the clay polish? Nice, or for the Dynamesh. I'm assuming that's what you mean by clay polish. That's awesome, man. I'm glad to share those kinds of tips for sure. All right, now let me see. I'm going to check my top profile. I'm going to go in with the move brush here and just kind of bring back a little bit of that skull. And if you look, if you did pull up those planar images, I mean, you get a pretty nice little plane happening about right here. Okay. Now I'm fiddling again. So let's go back to this front plane here. Re-Dynamesh that with that polish. All right. Not too bad. It's at least getting me in the ballpark of a face. I think it's going to help me a little bit more. And then the rest I will kind of go in and check that little side profile. You know what, guys? Give me 1 second. I'm going to open up a window because this office is crazy hot. I'll be back in 2 seconds. All right. Sorry about that. And I'm not even hitting all of them at this point. Like, what I'm probably going to want to do here is, I know we've got space going around the nose. Using just the clay or Claybuildup to kind of just subtract volume. So I get enough of the curvature happening here. Zofar, you're saying if once I make it, can you add it to Fortnite? That is a really great question. Well, we definitely have a good relationship with the people at Fortnite. They were going to present for us at the ZBrush Summit 2 years ago, but they had some issues, some legal issues that they ended up having to back out last minute, but they gave us some really great stuff, and they use ZBrush a ton for their characters. I don't know, man. Maybe we could reach out to them and see if they'd ever be interested in letting us put a ZBrush character in there. The official Z-Man. That would be amazing. Matt, and you're saying, why am I using Dynamesh on? For me, because I like to use Dynamesh because the polish feature. So the polish feature, because I want this to be stylized. I'm trying to do the sort of planes of the face. And the polish feature allows me to actually go through and remesh to capture these hard edges. So this is a preference. You could definitely very easily use sculptors if you guys like to use sculptors. For me, I'm more of a Dynamesh person, honestly. I don't like dynamically resurfacing personally, but it's a very powerful tool in other ways that I've found great uses for. And of course, when we were in development for that feature, it's one of the most widely requested features for sure. So many people loved the program Sculptress, and once it became a part of Pixologic, having that functionality in ZBrush is so huge. But for me, I just like the simplicity of sculpting on a surface and then adding resolution when I need it instead of it changing too frequently, mainly because I swap back and forth between brushes, I think, too often. And I just don't want to have to deal with the time. For me, it's a little bit easier to kind of stay in Dynamesh. All right, so I got rough outlines here for the eyes. Now what I want to do is I want to start getting in just a quick nose. So what I'll do is, you could do a couple things. Let's maybe go in. You could cheat, right? You can go to the brush palette, open up the IMM body parts, and just grab a nose. And I'm just going to go in with Symmetry on, click and drag, bring this out, and we could go like this, scale this baby up. Now, while it's in this mode, what you can do is, it's basically drawing the object on the surface, and you're getting the insert mesh is unmasked. So if I go to the move brush, I can start like pulling in those back face surfaces to make sure that this stuff is sort of in the right place. I could use the rescaling tools, which is really nice. And since I want this to be stylized, maybe I'll kind of go in here and play around with that shape. For my character, I ended up pulling everything out. I pulled out the nose. I sculpted it by hand, the lips as well, which, you know, is super. I feel like it's an important thing to do sometimes, to at least have the skill to do it. But when you need to, especially for time's sake, you know, you don't always want to have to go through and sculpt everything. So then Control Drag, and then I get a Dynamesh. Now, in this case, because I have a new shape, when I redrag, it kind of loses some of the defined parts in that insert brush, like losing the nostrils and everything. For me, I want to keep as much of that as I can. So in this case, what I'm going to do, Hired Gun says, kit bashing, yuck. I know, awful. It worked for Star Wars, man. If it works for them, it works for me. But yeah, it's the old artistic integrity thing. J Murph, you're saying, can you show the polish feature one more time? Yeah, sure. So the polish, what I'll do here is I'll run it. So if polish is on, what it's doing is it's looking for any edges. So if I go in and I do, say, a Damien standard stroke, I hold Alt and I draw a stroke here. What it's going to do is it's going to see those vertex points are closer together. So when I remesh with polish, it's going to sharpen those edges. But it also depends on the resolution of the surface too. So if it doesn't capture those edges correctly, in this case, what happens, I'll go back and I'll show you this polish in a second, but what happens with the nose is it can't quite capture it. So if I increase that resolution a little bit higher, let's go up to about 200, and that's going to go through and capture it more. You'll see here what polish did is it sharpened, because these edges are so close together and they're sharp here. When you remesh it, it's remeshing those edges together as well to make them nice and sharp. So the difference is if I turn polish off in a re-Dynamesh, you'll see that this is what happens between edges. You get this, these soft sort of surfaced or corners, basically. So if you can always turn them on and off again. So then if I go in, like you'll see sometimes what happens in here is you'll get these little artifacts that happen from the previous polish. So if I leave this as is and I turn polish back on, control drag, it's going to reassign in those areas. So I try to minimize the amount of polishing that I get. I don't want to like have too many sharp edges, but it's a nice trick to have. So I'm going to go back one little step here before I actually Dynamesh this nose together. And I want to keep the sharp edging from what I have, but in this case, I don't want to do any polishing for this part. So I'm going to turn polish off, but what I am going to keep on is project. So what project does is it looks at the existing surface. When I remesh it, it's going to try and keep those edges. So with project off, just take a look. You see you get this. So I'll do a snapshot, or I can't do a snapshot in this version. Old tricks. Well, okay, so what I can do is just take a look here, the soft edging. Now, if I undo it and I turn project on, re-Dynamesh, you'll see projection actually keeps those sharp edges from the previous remesh without needing polish. So the only reason, what happened here is projection has this little sub-projection option, which what that does is where it sees those sharp corners or sharp edges, it puts more vertex points. So this is kind of similar to what you get. It's like comparable to Sculptress in some ways, to Decimation Master, things like that. But the projection gives you... basically it reprojects those little edges and those details from that previous version. So I can kind of go in and do it like this, just to keep the previous edges, but I don't want to do any sharp edges for this nose here. All right, and then what I'll do here is, let's go. Yeah, render me gun, you're right. Kit bashing is a skill. I completely agree with you. It's a skill like everything else. Like, people have issues with sculpting digitally compared to sculpting in clay, but it's still it's a skill. It's absolutely a skill. It's just a different way of working. You can do amazing stuff with kit bashing that still requires crazy amounts of time. I mean, so much time. You can't really compare a sculpture that's been done in clay or in clay and bronze and it's the same sculpture in digital. I mean, you look at the workflow. It's absolutely harder to do in clay or marble if you want to go down that road. But I don't think most of us in this industry really, we're doing other things with our time as well. It's not just about the assets, but you're going into animate stuff and render stuff, and there's a lot of other skills you have to have. So for me, I like doing it this way just because it's a little bit faster, and yeah, you guys don't have to watch me sculpt the whole freaking nose. Yeah, the hamburger head Fortnite character is awesome. I have that up in my my reference board over here. I love that. I love some of the character designs. They're really great. Comics, so unfortunately with the whole lockdown and all this contagion stuff, I'm going to go up and reproject. I'm going to go a little bit higher. In this one, I'm going to turn subproject off and I'm going to remesh it so it doesn't, sometimes I don't like those triangles that I get at those edges. So I'm going to go up a little bit higher now. Few 100,000. Yeah, so what happened was the lockdown happened. I lost access to that printer in our office. So I got about 3 or 4 pieces in before all the bad news hit. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to bring the printer or keep it with me. So I'm going to have to postpone the completion of that one until we can all go back to work, or rather go back to work in our offices and places that we normally go. Yeah, render begun. That's a good point. You're saying you can't kit bash the face unless you know the proper forms. Absolutely. I mean, you could you can Mr. Potato Head it and drag and drop stuff in, but if it's not right, it's still not going to look good. So, and even now, I'm just noticing that like I have little things here that I probably need to adjust, but you know, we'll save some time here. I'm just going to kind of leave this as is. Now, one little trick with, you know, you could keep the planes here. Like, I always like to go in with the mouth here, and let's just start by, I'm going to grab the mask pen. So a little thing with, in my custom UI, the ZBrushCore UI doesn't have the mask pen here. I select it here, go into the brush palette, you should find it. If you hold Control, you should find it up here. So I turned on Enable Customize, and I put the mask pen. So go into Brush. If you go Enable Customize, basically the pen's not here. I keep a couple of materials down here on the left side. And I also turn on double side and backface masking. Backface masking is really important to protect other sides of the mesh if the mask is being assigned to it, if stuff is really thin. So like if I go to maybe something like this, and if I do a mask, you'll see like on a really thin surface like this, if I hold Control and I paint a mask, it's going to paint it through to that other side. It has a tolerance or a distance that it has a default setting to. So if you hold Control, you go to Brush, Auto Masking, and you hit Backface Mask, that's assigning this to the Control key, which is the mask brush. So when I let go of Control, you see that button turns off because Control isolates the mask pen. So with Control, Backface Masking on, if I paint a mask, you see you get that protected. So for me, that setting is buried in a little palette over here. So I go to Preferences, Config, Enable Customize, and I go here, hold Control-Alt, drag this thing into that interface. And I dock that there. As well as Brush Palette, Control-Alt, grab the mask pen, put that here. And then I even went a little bit further, and I opened up Material Palette, and I like to use the Matte Cat Pearl sometimes. I like to use Skin Shade for color and paint. And we'll just do Matte Cap Gray, because that one is, you know, a good default to be on, which is what we're using right now. Bamboozler, you're saying clay is easy, but getting symmetry is exactly why I didn't want to go for this character figure over here. I didn't want to deal with sculpting it asymmetrically, you know, like doing all the muscle and form. So I want this to, let's get this thing going so we can start getting into the body and shape. So the mouth, real quick with the mask pen, I'm just going to go in here and we could kind of like just grab a little chunk here. It's going to be crash test dummy, you know, at the beginning, unless you really want to spend time getting the foundations going. So I like to go in and just like, actually, let's do a sharper. Just going to create some space. I like to do this for the eyes. Let's make that go a little bit further. All right. Now, before I Dynamesh it, I'm going to go to Brush, Insert. You're going to Kit Bash. I'm going to bring in, I'm creating space to bring in lips. Let's bring these guys in. And then click and drag with Symmetry. Now, you can, I'm just creating the space so I can kind of get those lips in there. Bring this out. I don't want those to collide. I basically want to have a little bit of the inside of those lips available. So what I'm going to do is a little trick. I'm actually not going to Dynamesh this together because I want to have the mouth open just in case I ever need. If you go back and look at the figure, you know, he's like zoom up on this dude. Like he's got the mouth sac is open. Now this is something that's a lot easier to do in the full version of ZBrush. Side effects, what's up? But we're basically limited to Dynamesh in ZBrushCore, which is really powerful. We just need to make sure that those lips don't weld together with Dynamesh. And I saw a question back before I forgot to answer. Somebody was asking the main difference between Core and ZBrush. Is really, it's just the more efficient and proficient features, like Transpose Master, for example. When I wanted to do this project for Core, I was like, okay, sweet, it'll be no problem. I'll go into Core and I'm just going to sculpt it up. And you can do a lot with ZBrushCore. The foundation of ZBrush and ZBrushCore, there's nothing different. The brushes are mostly the same brushes that I use in full ZBrush, I use in Core. I still have Dynamesh, which is really powerful. But I don't have Transpose Master, which is in full ZBrush. So I can pose a figure in T-pose or A-pose with Symmetry, do all the stuff, build all the accessories, then I go to Transpose Master and I can just pose the thing in position and then reassign it back to the subtools. In ZBrushCore, we can't do that. So there's just a limitation of certain functions and features that just aren't available in Core. So I'm trying to work around those. In this case, like I'm doing, what I want to do is if I just control drag and clear the mask and do it again, it's going to weld this together and these lips are now going to seal up. But let's say I want his expression to be open, or I want to give the option to myself to be able to make that happen later. So what I'm going to do is just sculpt these lips, but leave a little bit of space. And the only way that I can really do that here is if I undo, go back to what I have the insert mesh. I'm going to go back to Subtool, open up Split. And after you draw this thing, because this is unmasked, we can do split unmasked points. So we can grab these lips. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm pretty sure this insert mesh here, let's see if I can go in. A little trick. So display properties, I put the double side option over here, which is Tool, Display Properties Double. I keep that in my custom UI. So that way, if I have it off, you'll see that you don't see some of the faces. And I basically want to separate the top lip from the bottom with a mask. So what I'm going to do is, let's just go in, turn on double side. And let's start by, I'm just going to grab a good chunk of the top here. Press Control W to give it a polygroup. And let's try this. So I'm going to go grab this polygroup with those selection rectangle, mask it off. Inverse, I'm going to control click a couple times to sharpen and blur. So I'm trying to get that line to cut off right here at the base. Now if I press Control W, I get a good polygroup for this part, the bottom lip. And then let's Control Shift click on these two and press Control W. So I get two polygroups. So what this allows me to do is make a mask. I'm going to bring this, press Control to soften or blur that a little bit. Now I'm going to go into the Move Brush and just kind of bring those lips open. Yeah, Control Shift S. Sorry, the shrink and the visibility controls, Control Shift X and Control Shift X is grow and shrink. Those are not available in Core. So in this case, what I have to do is all I can do is basically I can make a polygroup from a mask. So what I can do is I can press Control A, and instead of doing the visibility grow and shrink, which is those Control Shift S and X keys, all I do is shrink the mask with Control click and then Control Alt click to sharpen. You see if you keep shrinking, it keeps traveling further up the model. So once you get a good selection, I was basically able to do it that way. And then I basically, once I got it in place, press Control W to mask the polygroup, and then you get that selection. So then all I needed to do was cut it in half. And now I'm just trying to go in here and create some space so that this is really just so Dynamesh doesn't weld these things together. That's all. And again, it's going to look like Crash Test Dummy. So you see well, actually I didn't really need to hollow out the inside of that face. Let's, so we can, this is a little thing that happens with undo history. So I split these lips off already. These ones, if I undo, you'll see that it'll go back to the insert mesh state. But I'm just going to go back and clear this mask. Yeah, see, you see this is why the need for hollowing out happens. So the lips need some space to go. So I'm going to do, oh, looks like I just messed it up for myself. Let's just go back here and do that real quick. Inverse that, pull that back. Great. Now, these are going to be welded together. All right, so let's take a look here. Got to figure out, so usually in the ideal proportions, those corners of the lips line up with somewhere about the center of the eye, roughly. I mean, that changes with a varied level of degree, but for the most part, that's a good rule of thumb to have. So I could kind of keep this as is. Saeem, you said you want to learn ZBrush, you're just a beginner. Well, thanks for tuning in, and this is a good place to be. Just watching these streams, watching other people work is the best way to get started, I think. Of course, we have a ton of tutorials in zclassroom.com. This is a good place to learn as well. All right, so I'm going to probably have to do a little bit of readjusting for this, but these lips are separated now. So what I'll do is I'm going to take this head, merge this down on top of those guys, and then control drag to remesh. And now I got a good, at least the position of these things. Now this is where getting good lips, this is where like kit bashing, I still think is tough to do lips. I prefer to sculpt it mainly because if I just drag and drop something in here, I get the old fish lips, which is always, this is always just like a painstaking process. Like you can get good at it, but in my opinion, it's painstaking. Other people might not have that issue, but there's a progression in the stepping of the lips. Zolfo, you're saying clay polish can be used with Dynamesh or by itself. Yeah, that you can. Clay polish is just a button, so you can go to any model and just click clay polish and it'll assign it. But what it does do is it creates these really close vertex points that are hard to sculpt over once you clay polish. So clay polish, this feature is beneficial to do at the very end. So sculpt a figure and click clay polish a few times to style it up and you're done. If you're going to sculpt across it, you'll notice that like some brushes, like those edges right there, if I try and sculpt across the edge there, especially at higher resolutions, that edge becomes problematic to sculpt from clay polish, at least in my experience. So clay polish is better used with Dynamesh polish. So what Dynamesh does is it does the same thing, but it remeshes it every time, which allows you to continue sculpting on it. But yeah, to your question, in short, you can do that for sure. But anyways, back to the fish lips thing. These things are kind of a pain. So like there's a little bit of a progression here. The upper lip needs to be a little bit of a stair step. So that bottom lip shouldn't go out. It should go a little bit underneath. So I'm just drawing a mask over this top lip, making sure that this is got enough space. And this is also why staying in lower resolutions can be beneficial, because I can smooth my strokes out a lot easier and it's not that much of a pain to deal with. Yeah, so the eye sockets, that's going to be my next one. So I got the crash test dummy thing in here, and you know, getting the eye sockets is another challenge. So I'm going to go back to Dynamesh polish. Let's just re-Dynamesh this thing. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn polish off, keep project on. Let's go back and let's do those eye sockets. So similar process, trying to get the eyes in there. It's a really tough thing to sculpt those eyes. What I always recommend first is like the eye sockets themselves are pretty dug in. So if you look at, if you look at any reference, you look at the side, the eyeballs are going to sit somewhere, or the eyelids will sit somewhere around here, back from the nose. So the sockets kind of dip back in. If you look at any side profile, you'll see what I mean. So basically kind of going in here, let's just kind of like draw a mask. Control click to blur it a couple times. Alt click with Gizmo, and I'm just going to punch this back in. Although I just noticed that I don't want this to be too close. I want to have enough space here. There we go. Okay. So then, even though it's a little messy, just go in here, Dynamesh, and let's smooth this stuff out. So we're going to do something similar here. That might be a little bit too much, but if you're going to kit bash, this isn't too much. If you're going to sculpt it, this would be a little bit too much. Sculpting eyelids, I would say if Shubham, I'm sorry if I'm saying that's wrong. I'm sorry if that's wrong. Pro, take it easy, man. Thanks for tuning in. To your question, if you wanted to sculpt it, I'm going to make a tutorial video of this whole series that'll be up on Z Classroom. In this case, what I'm going to do is kind of kit bash this a little bit. So kind of just going in here and laying in some space here for the eye sockets. Now I'm going to brush, insert, go into the menu for this body parts brush, and I'm just going to grab this eye socket here. So this one has it has the full socket on the inside. So what I want to do is I'm just clicking and dragging to draw it into the scene. And what I'm going to do is just take this thing and I'm going to go subtool, split, split unmasked. So I get the piece by itself. Now to see it all, I need to go to Tool, Display Properties. I'm going to turn on double side so I could see both sides. So that's my double button over here. And then turn on Gizmo. And then Alt click here to go to Unmask Center. Now the Gizmo should be aligned to the object. So what I want to do is I'm going to start rotating, kind of getting this into position here. And I'm going to push this back in, or push it back in enough. So I want that eye socket to be able to live in this space here. So you see as I go back, the back part of the skull doesn't quite allow me to see all that. So I'm going to go to Claybuildup, and here I'm just going to kind of keep carving in this shape here. So I'm just creating more space. So this is one way to do it. I mean, it's not the only way, of course. This is just little tricks that I like to do to kind of speed up the process to give you a better start, basically, a better start for an eyelid instead of sculpting that thing from scratch if you're having a hard time with that. All right, so I really got to punch that back in there. There we go. All right, now I'm going to take this thing, make sure this thing's at the center. Because it's a separate subtool, now I'm just going to kind of go in here, use the move brush to kind of reposition these eyelids in here. Renderman, you're saying ever use Claybuildup with alpha number 6? Alpha number 6. Ooh, that's an interesting one. Instead of the square, using the little circle, you get the little, yeah, which is like that's an interesting thought, as a Claybuildup with that is nice. I use the clay brush, which basically has that same sort of draw stroke without that alpha, but it's very similar. The only difference is you don't get the buildup effect. So anytime I want that look, I use clay. Interesting though, I would try that out. It's a nice little workflow idea. I love changing stuff around like that. Okay, now this is where I'm just trying to be careful here that I don't destroy too much of this shape. So I can solo this thing out. So that eyelid should be sitting over top. So I still have it as its own subtool. And then now let's just figure out like position and all that. All right, so what'll happen here is this is a little thing that I might need to make some adjustments to. So the eyelids, I might have to move stuff around globally on the mesh if I have to. It'd be better to do that when it's all welded together. So what's going to happen right now is if I take this thing, I'm going to just duplicate both of these objects here, and move those down and turn those off. So here's one thing that happens. If you take a look at this insert mesh piece, it's a flat piece of geometry. It's not a closed shell. So it's not a shell of geometry. It just has basically one wall. So when you Dynamesh this thing, if you just go and you click, say, Control Drag to Dynamesh it, number one, you're going to run into issues like this where it's going to give you Swiss cheese. And then it's also going to close the part of the eyelid. So it's seeing this as a big hole, because this isn't a closed shell of geo. So that's going to create a problem if I go take this head now. I'm going to take this, do merge down, and then Control Drag to Dynamesh together. What it's going to do is it's going to close off that part. So a little trick that you can do with this kit bashing process here is I'm going to delete this. Let's go back to this head. Now, I would spend a little bit more time like trying to finesse like the shape while this thing is a separate subtool. Like try and really think about what the shape of that eye is going to be. How big do you want the eye to be? That kind of stuff is really important. So you can keep kind of working this mesh as a separate part. I think that's a really powerful thing to do, especially if you're trying to get a specific look. But just to kind of breeze through this, so what I like to do here is I'll rework these eyes once I get them on the final mesh. So I'm going to press Control A to mask off the whole section of these eyes. And I'm going to go to Subtool, Extract. And if I go to Thickness, if I click Extract, it's going to basically make an extracted part of the masked surface. So I can basically make a thick sort of eyelid. So I don't want it to be too thick. Let's go 0.01. Let's see what that does. Let's go 0.009 thickness. Extract. Okay, let's go a little bit lower. 0.008. Yeah, okay. Any kind of thickness, and then click Accept. Now I have a closed piece. So this has wall thickness. And that'll make this Dynamesh process so much easier. So now I'm going to go back to these eyes, delete those, turn this on. And then let's go in here. And I can turn on Gizmo. Here's where like you can maybe use Gizmo to kind of like reshape the eyelids, that kind of stuff. Move this stuff in. Yeah, I won't know how this is really going to look. But now if I take this head, let's go merge down. And then let's take this now and dive it. This should give me that nice clean shape there that I can now go in and I can smooth this thing out. And I can start to like tidy up those shapes. Yeah, so the panel loop extract, that's another one that we don't... panel loops is not a feature that's available inside of ZBrushCore. So in ZBrushCore, we can't use a lot of those features. So in that case, we wouldn't really be able to do much. Extract is really our only tool that we have available in this version. And Core does not have Z-Model the brush. So if you look at the brush palette, you click this open, this is what we got. So we got all the basic sculpting brushes, trims, we got a trim dynamic. The insert brushes, we have the chisel 3D brushes, we have the chisel 3D creatures, IMM body parts, and IMM model kit. Model kit's got some great stuff in here that we could make use of. You know, this one's got tons of parts that are good for Core. But yeah, so no Z modeler either. So it changes the approach. If you guys watch any of my other streams, like doing a lot of these other accessories and extractions and parts and pieces, even getting stuff like this is like, you know, it's challenging to get like these kinds of details, but it can be done as long as you understand the you know, what you get out of Dynamesh and things you can do. So I want to try and focus on that in this stream as much as I can. If not this stream, the next couple for this project series. So like now this is where like his eyes are just a little too sleepy. So this is where now I'd have to go in and start like sculpting this stuff out. So maybe like filling in some of this space here. And I could, this is something that I get stuck on, is spending too much time with eyes. Eyes are, of course, like such an important part of the character. We don't want to overshoot these things, but it takes a lot of time to kind of go in. So a lot of things I like to do is H-polish we can kind of use to like tidy up eyelid shapes. Something I'll do is I'll use the mask pen to kind of just cut this thing in half. So if you want to get that almond shape eye, just drawing a mask on it, because a lot of times with the Dynamesh, you'll get rounded out corners, right, if you're dealing with low resolutions. So cutting this thing in half and kind of just going in and moving this stuff into place. So I can get those sharp corners there. Let's bring this thing down, maybe bring this one up. So this is the trick that I like to use all the time to fix eyes in the corners. Is just draw that mask along the top half of it, and you're inversing back and forth with Control I. So if I want to fix this curve, I can kind of go in here with the move brush, or let's say make that like a flat sort of plateau. Right, this is where you're going to get your eye reference. then H polish, or you could even use Damien Standard first to kind of go in and get that eyelid lip. H polish to kind of polish out that top sort of chunk there. And of course, I like to use H polish along the edges here to really get the lips of the eyelid. So you want that to be a nice flat plateau. This just deals with like having a nice clean flat line here. If you consider like, I don't know, this is more of like a design technique in digital characters, but to have a three-dimensional object where light is going to hit, if you want it to look realistic, having a flat plateau like that, you'll see even here with the material, you get a nice clean light bounce. So you can actually go in and kind of like flesh out those edges there and get those things to look really nice. And then this is another one of those techniques where Dynamesh and polish, because I just H polished all these edges here, if I turn polish on and control drag, it's going to hold those shapes a lot better. So it's basically just tightening up a lot of that stuff for me. Let's see. Sorry, I'm looking at questions here. Vicharan, you're saying it's always not easy to make the eyelids the mouth so they don't look uncanny or puppet-like. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Shubham, you're saying, what's the name of the brush? And one more question, does skip history make any difference in QuickSave? Oh, I forget which brush. I'm sorry. You'll have to remind me. I don't even know when you asked that question which brush I was using. But the skip history, does skip history make any difference in QuickSave? No. So QuickSave, skip history, what that does is if you go to, oops, I need to turn off enable customize here. Skipping history is essentially just dealing with the history of the file, which in this case, we don't have any preference undo history settings here. QuickSave is always just going to save the file, but you don't get access to undo history in ZBrushCore. So this isn't something that you would be able to do like in full ZBrush, but they're different things. So skip history, when you have it, is if you have a file that's got, I don't know, say a gig's worth, maybe it's a gig file that has all your undo history of the whole project. If you have skip history, basically what that means is when you load it that next time, it doesn't load the file with all the history actions. It just loads the file in its current state. With QuickSave is always going to save the file with history if you have file undo history on in the full version of ZBrush. So basically, they're two different things. Skipping is for loading. QuickSave is saving, which is a totally different set of settings. So as long as you have file undo history on and you QuickSave, it's always going to save undo history. So hopefully that answers. And Vijaran, you're saying, did I have a trick for the mouth angle? That is a good question. The trick that I like to just like, the problem that I'm running into now is like, a nice shape, but this is where like I want to figure out, maybe I don't want those eyes to be so small. If it's stylized, I want those eyes to be a little bit bigger. I might have to go in and mask out a chunk here. And I'll get to the mouth here in a second, because that's one thing that I like to spend a lot of time on. And I'll show you the tricks that I use if it helps you guys. So drawing a mask around this with lasso, the mask lasso travels through the head, so it goes here to the back. So I got to clear that out. And then I'm basically just control clicking to blur this thing a lot. And then if I turn Gizmo on, alt click to reset, alt click to go to center. If you turn on, so if you scale this thing right now, you see they're going to scale to the middle or outward. So they're scaling to the world axis when you have two symmetry gizmos. So you'll see scaling downwards, it's not scaling in place, it's scaling towards the world center. So if, in this case, when you have symmetrical scaling effects that you want, when you turn on local symmetry, what that's going to do is, and this only works when symmetry is on. If I turn local on, it's localizing it to the gizmo. So now I can kind of go through and I can scale up those eyelids, kind of bring those over, bring them back out, and I can kind of just readjust like this. That to me helps a lot. Just if I didn't do it right and I didn't set it in position, I can just go through and, you know, I get a lot more out of the piece that I've already built, and I just now want to go through and just resize it, and then I just kind of smooth around the edges and all that stuff, right? And then so Vicharan, your question was doing the mouth. I think it was the mouth angle. Yeah, so the mouth angle number one, if you look at this thing from the bottom, the mouth always has curvature. So you think about the skull, it's just only stuff that I've learned from other anatomy instructors and just my own observations, but the teeth themselves kind of bow around. So the lips have a little bit of curvature, and the corners of the lips kind of, I mean, you have the ability to kind of go further back, especially when you smile, you're moving back towards the skull. Those muscles are kind of contracting and pulling up and in. So thinking about that, the mouth corners, number one, like these should be kind of in a little bit. So this is where, you know, you want to start to check your angles, especially checking just a bottom angle like this. Make sure that those lips have a good curvature. If a lot of times what I see with people that get fish lips is they're just flat straight across and they're level. So this angle is really important to check. Make sure you have curvature. And then that side angle, what you should have is you should have a basically a stair step of where the lips are supposed to go. So the top lip, you should basically get, this is one thing I've learned from taking clay sculpting classes, John Brown at Noman. This is one of his points of his topics that I've always remembered is the curvature curves that happen in silhouette. So with the nose, you tend to have a little bit of stair step here, with the nose being the furthest point out, the lips being the next, the top lip being the next furthest, and then the bottom being the third. And then sometimes the chin, basically sort of like stair steps down. So fish lips tend to happen where you don't have that proper sort of angle. So masking off just like the bottom half of this lip in the jaw here, I can control click. I like to use control click a lot to soften up the blurs. And then just even go to that side profile with a big move brush, and you can start to kind of readjust this. And of course, like try and keep that bottom lip a little bit further back from the top. And you'll start to get a little bit of a better shape. So you get curvature that happens here. And then once I start moving into the lips, like this part is crucial to kind of get right. So let's turn on double side here. I'm going to mask off this little polygroup here. All you need to do is assign a mask, but I'm going to go in here, turn on Gizmo, alt click with no local symmetry. I'm just going to take the Gizmo and just push this back. All right, so I'm going to give myself some room to sculpt in there. I'm going to control drag and then remesh it. And actually, I need to undo that. I don't want to remesh with polish. If you keep remeshing with polish, it's going to keep polishing previous edges. Polish is something I like to do intermittently, but right now it's making it look a little bit too crash test dummy like. So no polish. I'm kind of go in here and smooth some of this stuff out. Hired Guns, it looks like Silver Surfer. It does. I need to get this. Yeah, I know. Silver Surfer it's because it's like that bland expression. And it's the Matte Cat Pearl material as well. So let's get some flesh going in here. So here's what I like to do. Take this mask. I'm going to turn on Gizmo. Just punch this back through. And then control drag. I'm turning on polish, so I don't have any more polish. So I create a little space in there. Now, sculpting lips, getting on the insides, the top and bottom is really helpful in my opinion, because the lip curls kind of go underneath the corners there. So number one is if I want to start to get the right like sort of curvature, I want that to go back a little bit further. And then number two is I like to be able to grab, just like I do with the eyelids, grab the bottom of the lip and the top of the lip separately. So what I'll do is hold control, let's drag a mask across the bottom half there. So I'm just cutting it in half and I'm pressing Control W. And then what I'm going to do is reassign these groups together. So grab this one. I'll leave the poly group for the nose just in case I want to keep it. The insert brush techniques help because you get a poly group from those parts. That's usually a little beneficial to be able to mask it off and go back to something previous. But now what I get is I can grab the bottom of this lip. So what I like to do here is now I can go in with a clay buildup. Number one is I can really start to carve away the inside of the mouth. So this helps me to go in and define thickness for these lips here. So I can really, from this angle, I can start to, if you look at the corners, that little curve kind of usually comes out from the inside. Right, so starting to get the volume here, and then I like to be able to see how thick it is on the inside so I can kind of gauge just how thick those lips are. So going in from this view is a little bit more helpful to see. So I'm just carving away enough to have a good silhouette of those lips. That looks pretty good. So I get that bottom lip, which I can now go in, and here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. I'm kind of filling it in with Claybuildup, and now I'm just kind of going in with that move brush here. And I'm just trying to get the angle in which those lips are going. So this is one you need reference for sure. Now I'm trying to do a stylized sort of look. So just I'm keeping an eye on a couple reference images of stylized characters' lips that I like, but I'm also just trying to get just a general good shape for the lips to happen here. So if you look at the planar shapes of the lips, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So there's like, usually you'll get a little bit of dip happening here. So if you look at the muscles in the face, there's a lot of muscles traveling across here. So you basically get a little plateau that comes from here, basically a little triangle. This is elevated, and so is this. So these are basically little angles. So I'm going to go in with Claybuildup here, kind of fill in this little space. You'll see what I'm talking about if you just Google the planes of the human face. You'll find it. And then this one needs to be a little bit more elevated too. So if I go in with Damien Standard, I'm just kind of holding Alt and just clicking to fill in the space. Now, I'm going to have to fix this stuff a lot, but I'm just going to go straight with H polish and start trying to polish up this edge here. Vajarin, you're saying, oh, sorry, I got to go back even further. Shubham, you're saying the one from where you draw the eyes and the mouth, the only difference I found is skip history. It saves the file very fast. Yeah, you're welcome for the new method. The one from when you draw the eyes and the mouth, that brush is the brush. I'm pretty sure this is what you're asking. Brush insert. So you click on the brush palette. You'll find the IMM body parts brush. You click this one, it gives you all these body parts here. Let me know if that's not the brush you're talking about. Vicharan, you're saying you made pupils / eyeballs. My lecturer said they look like censored. Did you actually like sculpt it, or did you? Are you saying that you sculpted it? Because in my opinion, like I sculpt eyelids, especially for characters. I'm going to do that here in a second. Drop in some eyeballs to kind of fill this stuff in. All right, so you get something like this sort of happening, right? So this just kind of gives you, from that angle, you get a little bit more of a dip happening, which I find to be pretty just handy to kind of get more of that sort of shape happening in this area down here. And then I might just smooth that out. Okay, good. Shubham, that was correct. Sweet. Cone Dotes, what's up? You're asking how do you pan and turn the model to zoom in? The most most useful tip on that was to click outside the lines of the canvas. Oh, okay. Cone, so that's a great question. This has to do with primary and secondary navigation is what we call it in ZBrush. So primary navigation is left mouse button, click and drag to rotate in the canvas. Right. If you want to pan, you hold Alt and you click and drag left mouse button and drag through, the screen. If you hold Alt, click and drag, and then let go of Alt, you default to a zoom state where you zoom in and out. So that's our sort of like primary navigation. So secondary navigation, in fact, has to do with the right click button. So right click and control. So if you want to zoom in, if you hold control, right click on a part of the model and drag, I'm zooming into the part of where my cursor is actually selected. So the difference is when you hold Alt and just click and drag and then let go, it's zooming to whatever previous, like sometimes it'll lock a previous position, but by default it should be just zooming to the center of the world space or the center of the object. So if you right click and drag on the model, it's right clicking on a part. So for example, let's say I want to zoom into the eye. If I hold control, right click on the eye and drag down, I'm zooming in and dragging back out. So it's going focused into the eye. So if I want to go from here to the lips, Control right click on the lips and drag, and I can zoom here. So the benefit is here with this navigation method, you're talking about you can click in this little space here and you can rotate and you can move. But if you use right click, it doesn't matter. The canvas space isn't needed. You can right click on the model and drag, and you're just rotating from that position of the model. So Control right click to zoom, right click and drag to pan around. And then you could hold Alt and right click and drag to pan as well. So that to me is pretty. I only use right click navigation. Oh, well, I can't say only. Sometimes I'll use other stuff, but that to me is the most handy. I love right click navigation because it's more, especially when you get zoomed up like this and you don't have document space to click. I don't need it. I can right click on the model and rotate, Control right click and drag to zoom. So hopefully that. Let me know if that doesn't answer your question, but. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Digital Plankton, you're saying at what stage did you go from Dynamesh to Polymesh 3D? Polymesh 3D, you mean like a remeshed model? Technically speaking, a Dynamesh model is a Polymesh 3D model. So what I did was I started off with a sphere 3D, which is not, if you try and sculpt on it, it won't let you. You got to convert it. So I just took this thing, converted it to Polymesh, and I turned on Dynamesh for the sphere. So that's one way that you can do it. That's what I would recommend. If you otherwise, actually, I recommend going to Project, start from loading a Dynamesh sphere. But if you're just asking about when do I leave Dynamesh, that's going to be. It's a tricky thing because in ZBrushCore, oops, let's go back to standard brush, reset this thing. ZBrushCore, we only have access to Dynamesh and Sculptris Pro. So I'm going to keep this thing in Dynamesh the whole time. So it's partially why I'm kind of taking my time. I want to keep these surfaces separated. I'm starting at low Dynamesh, and I'm working my way up. So now I'm going in with the standard brush and just trying to like define. And I'm also like for these lip corners, the corners usually have a little bit of a dip in there. And so you don't want that to be too elevated. And then technically speaking, you always have like a little bit of muscle structure or curls here that can happen here towards the outside. All right, so now I'm just kind of taking my time with the bottom lips here. Let's go up to reverse this, go to the top, and do the same thing. Render me gone. That was looks like that's what you wanted. Cool. Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm glad I could share that one because honestly, it's not. I guess not everybody knows that about ZBrush, but that navigation to me is so helpful. So Yoon Park. Oh, thank you. I appreciate your kind words. That's very generous. I'm glad to share this info. This is honestly like, I'm sorry if it's taking me so long to actually get anywhere, but you get me talking about stuff, and I love to explain the nitty-gritty details. So I'm glad that you guys are getting something out of it. Sculpting like stuff like this, it's not the easiest thing to do while talking. You know, you get into those like focus states where you just need to kind of get in the zone, if you will. And that's pretty much what this part of the process is like really trying to get into that zone. But these little tricks, for me, with a little bit of time, if you're in the right zone, you will be able to get this probably a lot quicker than I am. So I'm kind of just going in here, and you'll see like leaving the space underneath that little part of the lip. I can kind of go from underneath and out. So this is something I found. The lips don't just go straight to the corners, like those little curls. They actually go underneath. And then now if I want these lips to be a little bit like thicker or basically thicker, this is what I like to do is, let's take this thing here. I take the standard brush and I draw one line to kind of frame the outer portion of the lip and the top, and let's remesh it. Yeah, thanks Digital Plankton. I appreciate that. That helps me. Good things do take time. You're right. But in this case, like, I don't know. Some days you're just better. Some, you guys know. Some days you're just on. Some days you're not. It really depends on the music that I'm listening to at the time. I don't know about you guys, but I need to get into like a good little state with music and not think about anything else. F key to frame for sure. That's huge. Yeah, a frame is so big. And I'm just noticing like all this stuff is a little bit off. So like you see, I'm checking my corners and these curves here, this all needs to be kind of filled in more. So this is another reason why going too high in resolution can be problematic, because I'm finding that some of these surfaces, like even this angle here at the side, technically speaking, the curve that should happen with the planes here, so you should get like, let me see if I can sketch this thing in. This should go here, and it should go all the way out about right here. So you see the distance from where that bone is kind of going and that portion of the eye is a little off. So I actually need to have more of the socket defined in here. This is one thing I'll do is, like you see, I was just working on the lips, and as I looked to the side, I started to see other problems that I hadn't seen before. This is something that I think is really helpful to do with sculptures, not spend too much time on one area, for sure. And this should be like... So you should get like a little hard plane here that cuts through. So this is a plane, kind of goes a little bit further out. And this is a plane, should go down and around underneath the eye. That eyelid just does not look good to me yet. Might need to push those inwards a little bit more too. We'll see. I'll come back to that in a second. But the curls here, like this is another one that I want to try and get this to work a little bit better too. So the planes, I might be missing a little bit of these planes here. So this piece should go a little bit more, should have a little bit more arc happening right there. Vajarn, you're saying you have difficulties with the space inside the mouth for game models. How big should it be, or do they even need one that is part of the head? That's a good question. It really depends on the game and what the character does. If it's a background character, like no, you don't need to worry about that stuff at all. But if it's a primary character, yes. Most of the time, what you'll have is a separate rig on the inside, which is just separate model parts or something that is like teeth, if those are something that need to be shown. It's always good to leave space. Mouth socket, eye sockets, it's always good to have space than not. That way you have something to work with. So if you're making models for games, they're always going to tell you, of course, like if you're working in production, what they actually need. But it's important to be able to anticipate that, and you never want to not have it. So I get in the habit of sculpting those things on a regular basis. I teach ZBrush in production and ZBrush in industries, and it's something that you just kind of do naturally. You always want to have that space than not. So leaving space for the eye socket. I don't know if this ZBrushCore, forget if it has this tool. The demo head has separate pieces for the teeth. Sorry, I'm hitting my mic. Pieces for the teeth, for the eyes, and even the tongue. Having a separate object for that, which I always recommend. If you can model things where they have separate objects, it's just so much better to do that than have it all be one solid mesh, especially if you don't have that much experience with sculpting. It's so much easier to do stuff with separate objects, in my opinion. So let's see here. Let's just get these lips done and we'll move on for now, so I can get to the proportions of the body. It's already 3:30. So here's where I would just go. I might mask off just the top half of the lip here. And once this thing goes, Digital Plankton, you're saying, do you design or set up your characters differently for game or animation? Design, it depends. It really does depend on how the character is going to move. in animation. So if it's animation for like film visual effects or just animated film versus an animated character, sometimes objects might collide with others. You get more flexibility with visual effects and animation because you get higher resolutions that you can deal with. So yeah, I do. It definitely, it just means that if you're doing stuff for games, you just have less flexibility. Although games are getting so much better nowadays that less doesn't mean, I don't mean that in a negative way, honestly. I mean that it used to be a lot harder to do stuff for games because you just simply couldn't have the resolution or the geometry to hold half of the stuff that you made. So you'd have to do tricks and cheat it and put it in maps and do all that kind of stuff. But now a lot of the AAA game studios are getting like high-res ZBrush characters that are able to go in at, you know, a few 100,000 tries or more. I think it's higher every year. So it definitely plays a part in design, yes, but it's such a hard thing to say. It really depends on what it is. If it's organics, not much of a difference, honestly. I'd say not much. But if it's like mech, you're getting into like hard surface armor, like mechanical stuff that's moving, that is definitely going to make a difference in how you would model or construct something. All right, so now I'm just kind of like, I don't want to get this stuff too close together. I'm just going to leave this for now. And it's still pretty crash test dummy. But this would be like the general workflow that I kind of go through and just start to polish this out. But now, like I don't want, this is where I might not want to, I'm going to turn off project here. Let's just re-Dynamesh this thing and just kind of go in. I'm going to hold shift and just reduce Z intensity. And just kind of go across and just lightly start blending a lot of this stuff in. So starting to get away from the planes. So I'm reducing Z intensity smooth just because I don't want to destroy too much. I just want to slightly be able to go in and smooth this stuff out. And then now that I have something like at least that resembles a face, I can start really working this thing to make it look like the person that I want it to. So now I'm starting to check like 3/4 angles. I want to start to like figure out like how defined I want these cheeks to be. And I might reduce the resolution down a little bit more. If I do that, be careful, like with lips, I don't want any of this stuff to weld or connect. So I want to be able to go in and kind of smooth this stuff out and get rid of some of these like hard edges like that 3/4. It's getting better, but now I really have to go in and start doing some sculpting. But before I get to that part, last little detail we want to add here for the character's head is, I'm going to go to brush, insert body parts, and I'm just going to grab a quick ear. So ear is usually lines up, on average, the top of the ear lines up with the eyelid, and the bottom usually lines up with somewhere around where the nose is. But because it's stylized, I might go in here, just make it a little bit smaller. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ear, I'm going to do subtool split unmask so I get that by itself. And then I'm going to take this now, and that arch is probably a little bit too deep back there. So I'm going to polish out bit more of this. Now let's take these guys. I'm going to turn on local symmetry so I can scale these guys in place. And then now, as a separate subtool, let's just kind of go in and start to move this stuff around. So I like to take advantage of this power right now. Instead of just welding it together, you know, that just creates a lot of cleanup work if it's not in the right place. You know, so separate subtools, again, help a lot. So let's go back a little bit. I want to turn that more. You might not be able, all that matters is having all the edges here for this insert mesh to go intersect or cross through this object. And that'll help to just weld this stuff together much better. So this ear, I want to give it a little bit more while it's in this state. Kind of just give it some more definition. Digital Plank, you say all your heads look like males. You find it hard to sculpt female heads. Oh yes, you're opening up a whole can of worms with that topic. It's one of the hardest things to do is sculpting the female form. The male form, it's partially, at least in my experience, the differences between the two, especially the faces, is elegant features as opposed to dominant features. So this is not the case for all people. Everyone's different, but more often than not, the female form is a bit more elegant in terms of the curvature of shape and form. So like you get down to the anatomy of it, really what it means is like male forms usually have a bit more distinct features. You have more muscle definition, more hard edges, whereas most female forms are softer curves. And trying to get those soft curves is hard to do. So it's easier to sculpt just like a male figure. Things tend to just look that way because it's you put too much definition in it. So the differences I see between it is just where to put in definition and where not to, where silhouette and curvature is way more important. So like what I'm talking about with silhouette is really not anything to do with anything on the model, the surface itself. But if you go look at like the model in an outline shader, so we go into Core and you look at this thing and this is the only one we have in Core. We don't have the one I love is in the full version of ZBrush, but this one I'll do. Like just look at it in matte cap gray. Like you look at the curvature that happens around the model. Those curves are usually, especially with the body, are usually a bit more elegant with the female form, and it's really hard to do. So it really, in my experience, it has to do with reducing those like brush details and surface details and really focusing just on silhouette is so important. And that's like, I'd say that's about the equivalent. Let's take these guys and merge this down to being a stylized character sculptor too, because you're dealing with less surface detail. So like it can be easier to sculpt monsters and creatures to get something to look like a monster and a creature than it can be to do, say, the female form, or even the male form. The male form I think is a little bit harder, but compared to creatures. But I guess if I'm saying anything, is just putting in details and surface texturing is an easy way to start putting stuff in and get something to a certain place. But when you work in, say, a Disney animation, or we've had some really great presentations actually. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. I host the ZBrush podcast. You can go to ZBrushLive.com. If you go to podcasts, we sit with tons of artists from different studios. We also have a lot of this content on YouTube. There's presentations from Disney. If you just look up Disney animation, Pixologic, YouTube, the good people at Disney gave some pretty great presentations for us over the years and how they use ZBrush in their character design workflow. And if you listen to these guys, I'll post this in the chat for you. They are mostly talking a lot about silhouette and like getting the gestural shapes happening in an object, not dealing with high resolution surfaces, but actually really low ones to manipulate that surface a lot better. This is one that they gave back in 2016. There's more you'll be able to find. And this is the kind of stuff I think is just as hard to actually do right because it's so focused on curvature. And a really great person to watch actually for this style is Danny Williams. Shane Olson. Shane Olson is a fantastic, amazing stylized sculptor. If you guys, I'm sure you guys have seen some of his streams, but he's really good at capturing that stuff. And I think that is a masterful skill that takes a lot of time and patience to learn how to do correctly. So it's a long-winded answer, but yeah. So I got this thing like shelled out, and now I really need to take this thing and like turn it into a face. Like to get from that to like a figure like this that has all the shape and the style that I want. This is pretty much the same thing. I just really spent time. I reduced a lot of the planes. So taking this stuff, smoothing it out like I just did, and then really start just moving stuff around. Reducing resolution will make this a lot easier. So simplifying this process now wouldn't be so bad to step back a little bit. Yeah, thanks, Hired Gun. I appreciate that. Yash, you're saying, how did I do the mouth cavity? All I did was I just took, like, if I do it, I just took a mask, inverse that, turned on Gizmo, and I just pushed that through, and then re-dynameshed it, and then I sort of shelled that thing out. So I just pushed it through first, but if you, this stream will be replayed, so you can watch me go through. It'll be on YouTube forever, and I'm going to do this as a project-based series. So we got a part of the head done. We got the head done, but I'm not necessarily satisfied with the style. So I'll probably, in the next stream, once we get the body all sort of in position, I'll spend some time actually style sculpting this thing, trying to get it to look like a face, to get more to the final product here, right? So to get to this, the next thing that we need to do, yeah, you're welcome, Digital Plankton. I'm glad that I'm able to give you guys some answers. Vicharan, you're saying most games just seem to use double sides faces. Double side faces. I don't know what you mean by that. Renderman or RenderMeGone, you're saying sometimes with multiple objects using transparency, this transparency button, the brush can't reach into the deeper objects passing through this one. Oh, I see what you're saying. So if there's like your object is passing through another object and transparency is on, yeah, you won't. So basically, this is something that the underlying functionality of ZBrush is looking for. What it's looking for is it needs to see the actual surface normals. So if it's intersected with another object, you may not be able to capture it. It depends on the brush stroke. Sometimes the brush stroke is able to capture it, but if you're really close up, most likely this is just you're not going to be able to do that. What I like to do is I use solo option a lot. I know that you want to be able to see the objects with transparency, but I'll just quickly solo something out to kind of go through. And if I'm close up, just hit solo real quick and I can go through. But there's not much you can do outside of that if you're using transparency. But I will make a note to I'll talk with our other developers and we'll see if there's something that we could do to make that function a little bit better, if there's a way to do it. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so I know that I'm slow moving here today, and I haven't really gotten much done outside of this crash test dummy head. But I got at least, like, we got enough of the form and shape. Now I'd probably go in and I'd start to, like, this is where I like to use, like, clay brushes. I want to start to, like start laying in foundation of, like, curvature. I want to start getting more of the eyelid shapes to kind of come in here. So I start sketching it in. And then going in with like a clay brush or like a Claybuildup to kind of like fill in the gaps here. And then, of course, start reshaping those eyes. But to kind of get through, and let's just talk about setting up the body. So I'll show you guys this image again. This picture, getting into proportions. So if I want to do the proportions of this figure, for me, I like to break stuff up into separate pieces. So this is talking about Shane Olson. I see Shane Olson is one of those designers and artists that uses this kind of technique. A lot of people have adopted this simply because it's easier to work the shapes, especially muscle groups, particularly muscle groups. I find that this is really helpful, as opposed to doing something, say, with a Z-sphere, where you build the whole body. If you just go into Z-spheres and you load one of these armatures, you can turn it into a skin, but you basically have a blank canvas of a body that you have to go fill in. Whereas if you sort of work your way down the body, I think you can do a lot more with this. So, for me, RenderMeGone, you're saying, I am so informative. I appreciate that. Anyways, yeah, so let me get through this part. So what I want to do is I want to get the proportions of this body lined up, right? So to do this, I want to do same kind of proportions for that superhero, 7, 8 heads. So let's take this head here, and I'm going to just duplicate it. And I'm going to turn on Gizmo, recenter this thing, move it over. Now, this will be the one that I'm going to sculpt on. This piece, I just want to do the scale, right? So I basically want to go in here. I'm going to take that, and if I want to do duplication 8 times, if I hold Control, make sure you Alt-click, put Gizmo at the center, and Alt-click to reset orientation. Control, click and drag, and I'm going to keep holding Control, and I'm going to position this just below. Now I'll let go of control, and if I keep dragging downwards, it's going to duplicate these heads. It's basically doing a duplicate special transform. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Boom, and then clear the mask. So essentially what you're doing, I'll show you one more time. You hold control, drag down to the position that you want to do the duplication further, and then once you get it in place, let go of control and keep dragging, and then it'll keep going. So I got to zoom out here to be able to see this, but just keep that control key down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this guy will be superhero proportions. So I know it's kind of crazy just looking at the heads, but the heads actually indicate, if you look at, say, the image, for example, I'll pull up these images. Just look at the correlation between the lines happening between, just say the guy with the pink pants, the stone guy with the little drapery. The torso basically is the second head to the second head to like 2.5 heads basically, and you can draw lines even just to kind of give you indications of how tall the torso is, how long the thighs are, where the hands meet the waist, things like that. So it can be really helpful to kind of use that as in reference. So for me, this is like just a visual marker to kind of measure this stuff. So, and I'm just doing the same thing. I'm taking an image and copying the head in Photoshop, duplicating it down a row, and I'm drawing those lines so I get a marker that I use for reference. So these heads I can use in ZBrush as just a visual marker to line up with the reference image. So then from here on out, what I'm going to do is let's go back to this guy, and let's do insert, just insert a cylinder here. I'll turn off the proportion heads for now. We'll keep those there for later. So we just want to get neck, and I'm going to start by keep everything at Dynamesh 32 low res and turn on symmetry. So press X. So I get it's just a little cylinder for the neck. Let's go insert. So I'm always inserting, that puts it down the list. So head, neck, chest, this will be torso. We can rename this torso. And I'm going to go Dynamesh at 32 res, turn on symmetry, and then this time I'm going to turn on Gizmo, scale this thing up, maybe stretch it out. All right, so what we can do is, so just in that image, the torso was from about 2 heads, maybe down to about right here. Right, so basically this head, and this head is going to about here for those ideal sort of proportions, which I'm looking at in my reference. So I can kind of start by filling this space in. Renamigan, you said you learn to do things. The control function. You're talking about control zoom. Oh, you're talking about this duplicate. Yeah, that's a good one, right? That's a really good one. Okay, so just from here on out, like I'm going to do this for the rest of the parts, of course, but let's just focus on just getting some shapes happening in here. So let's go. He's got that sort of like, I'm going to use that stone figure sort of concept reference here. So I'm using H polish to kind of flatten about here. And let's go in. I always like to define, for me, the torso, the biggest thing is that rib cage. So Claybuildup rib cage essentially travels all the way through. Right, so you get a little bit of, let's go like here, all the way to the back. You get this sort of like barrel chest kind of thing going on because of the ribs. The ribs kind of define that shape. And then here, let's go kind of sketch in where the abs will go. So the ribs that you see, although they travel all the way through the back, of course, you don't end up seeing a lot of the back rib cage. You usually end up seeing it up to about here, that front sort of front half of it that goes up underneath and gets sort of covered up. If it's a strong figure, it gets covered up by muscle groups. So like the lats will travel here in the back. So we can go in, just kind of start sketching in, like lats are going to go here. This will be that center spine area. The lats kind of go here, right? And then you get the traps that go down and shoot across. Go up to the neck. All right, so then I'm going to keep kind of sketching this stuff out. Now he doesn't have any hips, so let's kind of go in here. This is where those abs are going to start coming out. Shortcut for Gizmo 3D is W, or basically any of the move, scale, or rotate buttons. So I always used to use W. That's my default, but it's basically turning on any one of these. So it's W, E, or R. And then Q goes back to draw mode. This looks like somebody was asking about Transpose Digital. You're saying, do you still use Transpose Tool? I do actually. I always use Transpose, but in Core, it's actually really helpful to do stuff like this. So say I position Gizmo here on the side, I refresh it. You don't have any clipping brushes in ZBrushCore. So you can use H-Polish to kind of go in and flatten out surfaces, but this is more organic. It kind of travels across the model. So I could use it to kind of go in and do stuff like this, right? I can kind of start like styling out that sort of edge there, right? And like even just styling out this stuff. But if I want to flatten a model, a part of the model, if you align the object with Gizmo and turn this off to go to Transpose, let's realign it this way. With the move option, if you click on the circle with the X, Y, and Z controls and drag towards the model, you can flatten and do it like a simple Gizmo trim or transpose trim. So if you guys don't know of this feature, it's a secondary feature. If you just click once, it draws it along a path, and then click on this point and drag it towards the model, you can go through and you can flatten. So to do little flattening techniques like this, to like flatten out shapes and stuff like that, Transpose is a really great feature inside of Core that we can do this kind of stuff with. So I use that in replacement of other things that I would do with the full version of ZBrush, and it's really powerful. And so that's where I tend to use it a lot. I also will use it for posing still. I like to use it for posing of like bones, like arms and fingers, that kind of stuff, which we'll get to in this series. So now I need to start by like filling out where the hips, get those bony structures in there. So the bony structures, I think, in the torso that are really important is that just the definition of where the rib cage is going to be. Of course, those hip bones, because that kind of gives you the right kind of width, fills in that space. Now let's go back here to those lats, and I can start by just like sketching those in. It's not going to look great, but what I'll do now is let's carve that out. So that's going from underneath that shoulder blade down. Let's go with mask. Lasso. Now I can draw a mask over this, and what you end up seeing is like, especially when the arms are out, the lat muscles will show in the front view. So just masking those things out, I can kind of go in. You should start to see those things sort of protruding through, and then of course like it will intersect up here with the shoulder once we get that in place. So let's kind of tidy up some of this stuff and start reshaping this. So I'm not afraid to kind of go through and destroy some of those lines in there. Really, maybe I could just focus on silhouette, which is a good place to start before you get too crazy with the muscles. That's another lesson I've learned. Don't go too heavy with that stuff until you get that foundation in there. All right, so we get torso. Now let's go in and just kind of start bringing this neck in. And then this piece, of course, is not going to be This is going to serve as like trap muscles. So I can keep editing this part. This is what I love about this is I can go back to this later. So that's going from like about head down to about here. That'll work. Now let's go in and let's start inserting other parts. So I'm going to just drop in. This will be, go back to Gizmo here. Man, it's already 4 o'clock. I'm going to have to cut this off here in a second. So now I'm going to go in. This is where I need to start concepting out the shoulders. Let's turn off those proportions for a second. Take this piece, go Dynamesh low. Say Dynamesh 32. All right, now this muscle here is going to come to a little bit of a point, so you get this piece kind of travels to the back. This one kind of sits about here. Yeah, I'm going to have to probably cut this thing off here since we're getting so close. I could probably spend some time to answer some questions with you guys, but I'm only scheduled to go from 2 to 4 today. Unfortunately, I have to get back to work. But what I'll say is I'm not going to stop. I'm going to leave this as is. We'll come back to this, and I'll do better the next stream to kind of speed through this process. But I'll just quick save this to kind of show you where I want to take this is following this approach here. What we can do is once this, let's go load that stage. What I like about this technique is it gives me the ability to basically go in here. Let's turn those babies off. Is I can take that torso and I can sketch out all these parts, right? And I get nice shape and form. I get separate pieces that I can basically break off. I can choose like how I'd make those adjustments, inserting primitives for big muscle groups so I can modify those and make changes to it. And the benefit here is what we'll be able to do is, since we don't have Transpose Master, what I'll be able to do is essentially take, say, grab the shoulder, for example. I'll be able to position this, put this roughly into place, turn on Transpose All, and I can grab all these muscle group parts while they're still sort of in their editing phase. And I can take this thing and I can start to like pose stuff out. So I got extra little groups here. Eventually I like to consolidate like big groups. So like all the parts of articulation, I want to keep the forearm parts as one. So the shoulder and all these parts would get merged and dynameshed. This piece would be one, hand would be one. And I could basically start to position this and get this thing into its pose sort of state. And then once it's posed, then we still have all these extra little subtools and pieces that we maybe want to go through and make changes to. So the final pose version with all these parts, I'll take a look and show you guys. Some of these parts will be merged, but you basically get this thing into a pretty good state. It'll look pretty silly without any clothes, but once it's in its pose state, once we get all these parts sort of blocked out, then you get a lot of good form and shape that you can go from there and build those accessories on top. So we can shell all this together. And then we'll be able to go through and make those accessories. So I'll pick back up from where we left off. We'll come back in this next stream, and eventually we'll be able to get to that final result. And I'll be able to show you guys some cool techniques for building these accessories. Modelista, you're welcome. Thank you for staying tuned in. I appreciate all you guys so much. Yeah, Render Me Gone, thanks for the great questions, and I'm glad I could show you guys, give you some insight on this stuff. Ray Libby, you're saying usually how much time does it take to model this kind of a character? So this kind of a character, I mean, for me, it's usually if you're working in production, they're going to give you a couple weeks to build a character. That'd probably include some topology and UVs and stuff like that. But for me, I mean, this took me to do the full thing. It took me a couple days. It took a couple days to like block it out and get all the sculpting done. It took me another day or so to go through and think about what I wanted to do for paint, just getting the color stuff set up, adding little details. Like, I'm not done with this by any means. So I would probably spend like a week on something like this and be able to get it done to a pretty good place. But the foundation of this stuff, I mean, I talk a lot about it in these streams, but once you understand these concepts and you've sculpted enough and you can get, it really depends on, I think, especially if you're doing human characters, your understanding of silhouette and anatomy. So I'm trying to break this stuff down in a way that I think that is a little bit more digestible, things that I never got as a beginner when I was starting off in sculpting, and I'm still by no means one of the best sculptors. And for me, it's just I'm more of a technical person. So when it comes to the way that I make stuff, I think more technically and how I can make myself better. It's like some people can just take a body and make this incredible sculpture. But doing this approach, I think, gives you more freedom to kind of like explore these things and get a good result without getting stuck with the lumpy sculpts and the bad anatomy and that stuff. So hopefully this helps. And yeah, Utsi, you're very welcome. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate all you guys. Yeah, follow me on Instagram. Follow me there. You can send me messages. I'd be happy to follow everyone. And check me out on ZBrush Central, Solomon_Blair. I got some great tutorials. My last 4-part stream doing the Mandalorian helmet, that's all there. And yeah, otherwise I will be back on next week. And next week I'll be in ZBrush. I'm doing a totally different project, ZBrush Mashups. So you can check out that stream on ZBrushLive.com. You can check out the schedule and everything. So thanks everybody. Take care, and I will see you next week.